What's up everyone, Master Fox here today. We'll be talking about the top 10 decks that the TCG missed out on. For better or for worse, the division of the game into the TCG and the OCG means that we have had two separate card pools, which has created two separate metagames. Early on in the life of the game, the main differences were that we would experience around the same format as the OCG did, although we would experience it 3 to 4 months later. But now, with the split of the ban list, and I mean a real split, the metagames are a truly different beast. As a result, there have been many decks that we have missed out on solely because of us having different metagames and different card pools. For better or for worse, most of these decks either never reached our shores at all or were felt for only a fleeting moment. I'll be including decks that were available for an extended period of time in the OCG, but then only for a sliver of time in the TCG. So without further ado, let's get right into it. These are the top 10 decks that the TCG missed out on. Number 10. Arblade Turbo. Admittedly, we did have this deck available for a short period of time, around 2 weeks, but during this time there was only a single event, SJC St. Louis in 2007, where Arblade actually won the event. In the top 16 there were a handful of other Arblade decks as well, and in hindsight this deck is often regarded as tier 0, totally dominating the only event it was legal at. This designation is likely out of its sheer speed and power, which entirely eclipsed everything else in the format at that time. Even without the results to show it, I agree wholeheartedly that this deck, when optimized, would have decimated anything else at the time. 3 Stratos made the deck float and tutor insanely, and Reasoning and Monster Gate plowed through the deck with immense speed. I can confidently say this because its younger brother, Diamond Dude Turbo, which is nearly the same deck, did very well after the death of Arblade. It came to control the game all the way until the release of Phantom Darkness basically, which was one of the most format-defining sets of all time, but that's for a different video. Anyways, going back onto the topic, Arblade had also been hailed as one of the strongest decks relative to its format in the entire game, and it's very likely that it may be the most powerful deck of all time if we are speaking in terms of power relative to its own format. There was no other deck in the game that would really be able to match its speed or power output that existed back then. Unfortunately for us here in the TCG though, we only got to play with the deck for a very brief amount of time, but maybe that's for the better. Number 9. Dark Matter Dragon OTK. This deck was actually legal for a single regional in Virginia, I believe, and it showed itself to be very capable. It was able to compete with full power Nekroz, which is pretty insane to think about. This was Nekroz with 3 Preparation of Rites, no less. If you didn't know, at this point in time, the game was essentially polarized between full power Nekroz and prime Clifforts, which both towered over the entire previous metagame, even though the previous metagame was a format warping Duelist Alliance. Nekroz was just insanely fast and consistent, with Trishula crippling you and Unicorn shutting out any extra deck reliant decks. The only real competition thus was Clifforts, which could halt Nekroz in their tracks using Vanity's Emptiness and Skill Drain, both of which would be devastating to the Nekroz strategy. Despite this though, the Dark Matter Dragon deck had a powerful showing at the regional in Fredericksburg, Virginia, taking many top spots and even the second place at the event. This mere glimpse of the deck's power was enough for us to know just how good the deck was, even if you knew nothing about the OCG at all. The deck was fast and brutal, putting tons of damage on the board in a single turn. If you left yourself open even for a single turn or a single moment, that could cost you the entire game right then. It makes sense why Konami hit this deck shortly after. OCG results showed the same too, months before. Unfortunately for us, the elemental dragons were all banned before we can harness the true power of the deck to see its effect on the game. We may have been able to see something along the lines of a third coming of the dragon rulers, but alas, it was for naught. Number 8. 3 Gateway Legendary 6 Samurai. This was a deck that was allowed to rampage in the OCG for a far longer time than in the TCG. Although the TCG did actually have this deck legal for around 2 weeks, just as in the case of Arblade and the Dark Matter Dragon OTK deck, I promise that we will eventually get to real decks that were never available in the TCG, but I'll get back on track nonetheless. Legendary 6 Samurai made an impressive showing at the only event that it was legal for, and took 12 spots out of the top 32. I'm of the school of thought that if Gateway was not limited soon after on the March 2011 ban list, 3 Gateway Legendary 6 Samurai may have led to a pseudo Tier 0 format, rather than what we saw with Samurai, Gravekeepers, and Plants kind of fighting over each other. The OCG was actually incredibly innovative in the way that they utilized Samurai. Some using a build called 6 Bomber that used the mass driver first turn kill before siding into a traditional version to net the easy game 1 win, which would give you an insane amount of momentum, kind of like a snowball in games like League of Legends. But anyways, we're focusing on the TCG, where basically the most innovative things that were done with Samurai was the red and blue build, which Billy Break brought forth. It utilized some very interesting loops. The deck was pretty notorious even to this day, earning the moniker 6 Spam because of its noob-friendly nature. There weren't really any confusing rulings or complicated combos to memorize or learn. You just dumped your entire hand, made Shien, set a bunch of traps, some of which were warnings, before calling good game. It was probably for the better that we never got to experience this for very long. Even with a single gateway, I remember Samurai being a nuisance everywhere. Number 7. Train Dolls. Rank 10 Trains! Everyone loves trains, but Konami just seemed too dense to recognize this and capitalize on it in the TCG while Shaddolls were still a thing. Shaddolls synergized very well with trains, especially since Shekinaga was not only the Earth fusion, but she was also a level 10 monster, synergizing exquisitely well with the trains to form, well, the rank 10 trains. In the OCG, I'm not sure if some of you may know this, but there was a time where Construct was banned with Wyndham Limited, leaving Shekinaga as the only viable fusion. Sorry, Wendigo. Anyways, the deck was pretty insane, cranking out superior Doras and Gustav Maxes like no other deck before. The deck could even run Skill Drain decently, since everything in the deck is essentially a throbbing beat stick. The deck has tons of fanfare surrounding it as well, with the might of the entire legion of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Subreddit, under the former leader of the Train Coalition, Ratamakafon. Unfortunately, I did hear that he left the trains in the scrapyard to chase some Megazord or something like that. Not too sure. Well, back on topic. Train Dolls are really a very unique and interesting deck concept that utilizes high-level monsters as well as fusions, and this is something we will not see here in the near future, as key cards are still basically region locked in the OCG, and Shaddolls are basically dead in the TCG. The trains themselves also have a massive variety of applications in other decks as well, and I've seen variants ranging from things like volcanic trains to hero trains being played in the OCG with great success. It's just very disappointing to me that by the time they do come out here in the TCG, possibly in something like World Superstars 2, every use they could have had will be basically power creep from a bygone era. Kind of a tragedy. Number 6. Gishki Hieratic Hand Loop. Oh man, this thing. I don't even know if I can legitimize this with a slot on this list, but I suppose this deck qualifies for sure. This deck was basically crippled before it ever had the chance to terrorize any TCG events, with hits to M7 and Mind August on the September 2013 list, basically killing any chance the deck had to succeed. Not necessarily a bad thing, since I do recall sitting through while my opponent looped my hand back into my deck. But a tiny part of me, the sadistic part of me I suppose, wishes that we at least could have had this deck for a little while just to toy around with. I mean, we never got anything fun here in the TCG. We just get the nerfed version of whatever the OCG gets to play with. For once, I want to experience the primeness of something novel and powerful. I guess Burning Abyss is something like this, but who am I kidding? The OCG is basically just a testing ground so they know what will sell in the TCG, so that they can rarity bump the hell out of it. Sorry, I've gone off track again. Where were we again? Oh yes, we were talking about Gishki Hieratics. The deck had a hand loop that was nastier than even the wind-up loop, since it shuffled your hand back into your deck, basically making sure you can't even get a little bit of advantage out of those cards from the graveyard. And at the end of the combo, it usually put down 3 M7s onto the field, priming for an impending OTK with another monster that would be summoned next turn very easily. The deck was pretty dirty. I see why I had to go. Number 5. Makyura FTK. Out of all of the decks on this list, it is probably for the best that we did not have this deck ever playable in the TCG outside of traditional. This deck was likely one of the most consistent FTKs ever in the entire game, and it was especially deadly because it was very hard to disrupt and the deck got moving very quickly. The deck existed in the OCG in late 2004 and actually could have existed in the TCG, but the April 2005 ban list hit Makyura in both the TCG and the OCG, obviously due to the absurdity of the deck in the OCG during their previous format. We wouldn't get Exchange of the Spirit, however, until November of 2005, where obviously it was too late to ever make the complete deck. Although people did try Exchange of the Spirit, since it was still legal at that point in time. My goodness, I'm sorry guys, my tangent is making it seem like this is a History of Yu-Gi-Oh video. Let's try to get back on track. Like I was saying, the Makyura FTK was likely the most consistent FTK of the entire game, even more so than the Frog FTK, since it had access to a plethora of broken draw cards, such as Graceful Charity, Pot of Greed, not to mention the broken Painful Choice. All in all, despite the fact that the TCG never got this deck, all I have to say is that this is definitely one that's better for the game. Thank Hieratic that we never got this deck. Number 4. Kuraz Blade. This deck was referred to with several names, from things like Kuraz FTK to Junk Collector FTK, but my preference is Kuraz Blade, just to keep with the Arblade legacy. The deck functioned basically pretty similarly to Arblade, but it had an FTK endgame instead of the OTK and Arblade. Anyways, this deck is pretty old and it's really hard to actually find any information on it at all, partly because of its age and partly because it was exclusive to the OCG. I actually played this deck on YVD in late 2008 up to early 2009, although without the junk collectors. This is actually showing my age though, because I don't think many of you know what YVD is. I mentioned this in a couple previous videos, but it was a fusion of DN and Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro, but in the worst way. It was manual, had terrible images, and required an IP address to host and connect for duels, and had no ranking system at all. I talked about it before, as I mentioned, so I won't belabor it here. Anyways, I recreated the deck on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro just so you guys can see how it worked. Basically, the deck is a Turbo Magical Explosion deck that has a massive safety net in the form of Junk Collector. He could act as your pseudo Magical Explosion in case you milled all of your Magical Explosions, which was highly likely given the speed cards you ran, like Reasoning and Monster Gate. This deck could actually have been used in the TCG, but the lack of Junk Collector to this day has made it subpar, and the limiting of Magical Explosion basically makes this deck dead, even if Junk Collector were to make it to the TCG today. That's another thing I want to talk about, is the fact that Junk Collector has existed in the OCG for something like 7 years and has not made it to the TCG. This card definitely needs to be printed in the next World Superstars. Number 3. Chronomaly Artifacts. This is actually one of my favorite decks on this list, and this was a deck I was generally very fond of and found very interesting in concept. At the time in the OCG, Nebradisc was a force to be reckoned with, serving the role of a Stratos and a Wolfbark all in one card. That is pretty amazing and scary all in one package. Remember, this was before the existence of Satellar Knights as a deck. Even to this day, Stratos and Wolfbark clones are still very powerful in the game, and Nebradisc is no exception. Combining the rank 4 and 5 capabilities of the Chronomaly engine with the control aspects of the artifacts, namely Moraltech, the deck found major success in the OCG as a Tier 1 deck. In the TCG though, Nebradisc did not come out until World Superstars, where it no longer could find a place in the game. Moraltech had already been limited and the game had power creep past Chronomaly. Even though we have all the pieces for the deck today, although with a neutered artifact engine, the deck just can't stand up to the other decks we have today, unfortunately. The deck would have been the only deck outside of windups that could have been meta that was fully capable of using rank 3, rank 4, and the rank 5 toolboxes, something very few other decks can actually say. Although Constellars can actually do it, but they're pretty non-competitive anyways. And I don't really count windups in this group, as their rank 4 toolbox was pretty much crap compared to what Chronofax could access. And also, one of the coolest things is just the deck name. Chronofax. That's just such an awesome name, don't you guys think? It's even better than a name like Teledad even. I really wish that we had been able to use this deck. This is a very neat deck. I'm very disappointed that we never got to use this deck because it's one of my favorite decks. Number 2. OCG 3-Axis Fire Fist. This deck ran 3 Blaster and 2 Burner on top of the 3-Axis Fire Fist engine to give the deck more range and damage potential, as well as access to rank 7s. Remember, this deck had 3 Rekindling as well, giving it a lot more recovery power than exists in the deck today. Rekindling also worked on Burner too, which is a very nice plus. The deck, in my opinion, was one of the most unique and interesting variants of Fire Fist of all time, as the deck was incredibly versatile, very fast, and in some ways reminds me a lot of Mermails. For me, one of the biggest disappointments of all time behind Chronolacis was not being able to play this deck. It was a very fast, aggressive deck that was very consistent, yet also had the ability to recover and grind. It had access to both the rank 4 and rank 7 toolboxes, and honestly the easiest way to describe it to someone who doesn't understand it is it's kind of like Fire Mermails, as I mentioned before. It played a lot like the aggressive strategy of Mermails and could OTK easily too, with backup from Blaster as well as Rekindling. Blaster's popping ability let you get around annoying cards, and all in all the deck was a blast to play. No pun intended. I'm very sad that Konami decided to hit Spirit before this deck could be played, even though they allowed the abominations that were Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks to exist. The moment I saw Spirit on the list when Rooster was just coming out of Judgment of the Light was one of the craziest ban list moments ever. Rooster was hyped like crazy to nearly $100, and just like that, the deck was killed. 3-Axis finally came back earlier this year, but by now the deck had already lost too many tools and power creep had gone too far for it to truly do anything. I mean, Jeff Jones did manage to top with it, but it's not the same. I really wish we could have seen its potential in September 2013. I'll admit I'm a tad biased about this deck, but I'm sure a lot of you were disappointed to be unable to play this deck too. We'll be going straight into our number 1 because unfortunately there won't be honorable mentions in this top 10 list since there's just not enough decks for me to put up into an honorable mention. Number 1. OCG Zombie Dad. While we had Teledad, OCG had Zombie Dad, and I would argue that Zombie Dad was a far better deck than Teledad was. Too bad it only existed in the OCG. They had Brionac at this point in time in addition to Goyo, which coupled with the 2 Card of Safe Return, making for an absurd deck. When talking about the best decks of all time, everyone mentions Teledad first, which is grossly overrated. It was a great deck for sure, but overrated as well. No one ever could remember OCG Zombie Dad, unfortunately, because we never got a chance to get our hands on it. It had all of the power of Teledad and more, with insane draw power and nearly limitless combo potential, with Malicious and Mizuki and Plague Spreader Zombie. Oh, and did I mention that they had 3 Burial from a different dimension? The deck was basically the originator of summon spam. Just watching the deck play, you could almost confuse it for modern Synchrons with Hyper Librarian, except their Librarian was called Card of Safe Return. The deck was fast and powerful and had access to some of the most powerful cards ever, namely Triple Solemn Judgment, Triple Royal Oppression, Premature Burial, and Brain Control. By today's standards, maybe the deck is not as amazing, but you have to remember, this was back in 2008, when decks were rather slow on average. The speed of the game would not drastically accelerate until Light of Darkness came out. Zombie Dad was one of the most fearsome decks relative to its own format, and a shame we could never play it here. OCG players revere it as we do Teledad, and there is good reason that they do. So that's pretty much it for my top 10 decks that the TCG missed out on. Do you agree with my deck picks? Was there anything that I missed? If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment in the comment section below. That's it for this video. I will see you guys in my next video. Thank you.